My name is Mark Kelly. I grew up here in Cassopolis, and I am here to talk about the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry, or the 102nd United States Colored Troops. It's kind of neat to be here in Vandalia for Underground Railroad days because I go to a lot of Civil War events, and it's like the slavery issue is the issue that it's like the big white whale swimming around and nobody really wants to talk about. They want to talk about states' rights, and they want to talk about all the glorious battles and the glorification of the Civil War, but then yet they're leaving out the only really legitimate reason to fight a war as terrible as our American Civil War, and that was slavery. And it's so funny, when you think about how the story of the 102nd and black soldiers has been washed out of history. It's almost been over 150 years before the story really came out. And the reasons behind that was right after the Civil War, Southern historians started manipulating history and rewriting the Civil War history. It was illegal to say anything bad about Robert E. Lee in the South. You couldn't even teach it in the schools that Robert E. Lee, technically, he was one of the biggest traitors in the United States of America history, but yet there are statues of him still. And these kind of revisionist writings even added to where we are today with the racial problems that we have. It's almost like the Civil War is being refought in a lot of ways. You hear about states' rights, and you see the brutality that's happening in the police force against blacks, which for all purposes seems very unnecessary. And so it's great that I can get here and speak to you about the 102nd because I think it's a story that really needs to be told. And it's an important story. And a lot of the history of the story came right out of here from Cass County. Many of the men that fought in the 102nd was right from Cass County. I mean, you can see the names in our rosters. You got the Birds, you have Lawsons, Boyds, Steels. You can go on and on and on and name the names of the kids I went to school with. And yet they didn't even realize that their fathers fought for their own freedom, for their freedom. And so that leads me to start about how it was very difficult for the black man to even get into the Civil War. He was really being kept out. For the first 2 years of the Civil War, blacks were not allowed to even fight in the Civil War. Now, some regiments that were not, federalized or were not what I call legitimate regiments were just like home guard regiments that blacks fought as early as 1862, especially in New Orleans for the New Orleans Home Guard, which was sponsored, raised, and all the money came from one man. And he was a black man from New Orleans, a rich black man, and he started that regiment. So that was technically one of the first regiments that actually fought in the Civil War. You also had some regiments from Kansas. Governor Lane's Kansas Cavalry fought as early as 1861. But for the most part, blacks didn't get into the war until after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Reasons behind that is that Abraham Lincoln was really afraid of losing what he called the border states. Kentucky, Delaware, and Tennessee, and those states who hadn't declared themselves for the South. And he was really afraid that if he turned the war into a war against slavery, that he might lose those states. And so he had to wait until public opinion kind of slowly came to the realization that the Civil War was really over slavery. And the original Emancipation Proclamation, he actually wrote in 1862, late 1862. And the main thing that it didn't really free any slaves, because all it said is that any state that was in insurrection by January 1st, 1863, those slaves would be forever free. Now, that didn't include slaves in the border states. You could still legally have slaves in Kentucky and Tennessee and Maryland and Delaware, and the federal government wouldn't do anything about it. And actually, up until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, federal government was actually returning runaway slaves to their masters. And so it was such a crazy situation that here we are fighting a civil war against the South, but yet we're helping keeping their infrastructure intact. And eventually they knew there was no way to win a war like that. You could not beat the South with one hand tied behind your back. And so the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really free the slaves, it freed Abraham Lincoln's other hand. And so now he could bring all the might of the federal government onto the South. Not only did it allow for the recruitment of black soldiers, it also took away the manpower necessary to sustain the South. So when you think about freeing the slaves, no, Abraham Lincoln didn't really free the slaves freed themselves. Anytime the Federal Army came into the South and took over area in the South, slaves flocked to the Union lines themselves. The Union soldiers didn't go out and free the slaves freed themselves and got to the Union lines. And up until, like I said, the proclamation was signed, the Federal armies were actually sending those slaves back. But that brings us to the 102nd. The 102nd, finally, recruitment started by a man, Henry Barnes. He was the editor of the Detroit Examiner, a newspaper in Detroit. Most of Detroit was really cool on arming blacks. There was a lot of people in the Detroit area, they call themselves copperheads, who really did not want to fight the South. They just assumed the big slogan was "Erring brothers, part in peace." They were ready to dissolve the Union to not fight the Civil War. And arming the blacks was something they thought might incite the Southerners to even a more fervent, war effort. And so Henry Barnes petitioned Secretary of State Stanton to be allowed to recruit a regiment of black soldiers from Michigan. Stanton then contacted Austin Blair, who was the governor of Michigan at the time, and got permission for Henry Barnes to start recruitment. Now the recruitment went slow at first, but there was a good group of soldiers that they went on a recruitment drive. And they used the train, and they also used the route of the Quaker Line, the Underground Railroad, to make train stops along the way. We also had one of the greatest bands in the Union Army, and the band would stop at a stop. They stopped in Niles, they stopped in Kalamazoo, they stopped, in Ann Arbor and Detroit. And every stop, the band would get out and they would play that martial music and pitch the fever of the young men up. And before you knew it, the camp was starting to fill up with recruits. The camp itself is Camp Ward. Camp Ward is in Detroit. And it was a segregated camp from Fort Wayne, which is also in Detroit. Fort Wayne was where all the Caucasian soldiers were stationed, and Camp Ward is where the 102nd was stationed. So even in Michigan, segregation still, reared its ugly head during the Civil War, especially in those first days of the recruitment. Camp Ward was in disarray. It was terrible. The adjutant general stopped at Camp Ward and said it was no better than a pigsty. And those men had to try to make it livable on their own. And that winter, come 1863, was one of the worst winters that Michigan had in many years. And the camp was in such bad shape. There was no windows in the windows. There was no glass in the windows. Doors were off the hinges. There was no firewood, no cook mess. So these men, a lot of the men at this time, got pretty frustrated, and many of them did desert. But the ones who stayed were really some intrepid souls, and they made a fine regiment. One of the men in particular that kept the guys together was Sergeant Major Parker Bond. Sergeant Major was just a regular guy, but he had extreme talents. He worked at Camp Ward as in the cook station, but on his off times, he would always go out and listen to the men giving the regimental orders. He knew Hardy's Manual of Arms better than any man at Camp Ward. And this type of dedication and this type of, intrepid soul made the 102nd what it is. And it showed that they had a really proud tradition. But after Camp Ward that spring, things got a little better. Parker Bond kept the men together, and those guys that stayed became a really top-notch regiment. And finally, some good news came. They were issued their uniform and their musket. And to men, some were ex-slaves, some newly freed, some had been freed for a while. But for men, to get that uniform, and like Frederick Douglass said, to get that eagle on your chest, it just made them full of so much pride that they knew that they were going to be a citizen. They knew they were fighting for citizenship, and not only that, they were fighting for manhood. They were fighting for manhood not only for themselves, but so that the world could see that the black man did fight for his freedom. That was very important to those men. They didn't want people to say that they were freed by someone and didn't lift a finger to help free themselves. And this was, excuse me, this was one of the muskets that were issued to the men in 102nd. This is the 1858 model Enfield rifled musket. It shoots a 58 caliber ball or a mini ball. This is a round ball here that would fit into the gun. And the round ball was some of the first ammunition they used. You can see it's just a half ounce piece of lead that was not very accurate. But right before the Civil War, a man in France named of Mini invented this bullet right here called the mini ball. And you can see it's kind of cone shaped, and it has a hollow end on the bottom and little grooves on the side. So when you fired this bullet compared to that, this bullet would come out and just tumble, and it wasn't too accurate. You had to be real close to hit your target. But when this ball was started being used, the mini ball, once you fired it, the gases inside the gun would expand that hollow point in the back, and it would hook on to the barrel of the gun. And the barrel of the gun had little lands and grooves in it. So now this bullet would come out spinning. And it turned this gun from a machine that could hit something accurate at 50 yards to a machine that could hit something a half a mile away. And you can kind of see the difference in the tactics that would make that if you have a mass line of men with a gun that can shoot somebody from a mile, half a mile, accurately half a mile, it had a killing range of up to a mile. So if you saw a mass group of men coming, they could be a mile away. You could just put the gun up and boom, shoot it into the mass, and it still had enough velocity to kill what it hit. So that's one of the reasons why Civil War was such a bloody affair. That 625,000 men died in the Civil War, and some in the most grueling and horrific battles that you could ever imagine. Now, the 102nd themselves were not involved in some of those larger battles like I talked about. They really, at first, they didn't trust the black soldiers. So they really didn't have them in the vanguard of most of the battles. A lot of the black soldiers had to be used as more laborers than anything. They built fortifications. They destroyed railroad track. They repaired railroad track. They built bridges, which is a very important part of any warfare because, wars are won by logistics. And for the most part, blacks were used as part of that logistics. They did a lot of hauling, they did a lot of freighting, and things like that. But finally, the 102nd got its first taste of battle. They were out repairing a railroad track in Baldwin, Florida. And the track was surrounded by woods. Sergeant Major Parker Bond, being ever vigilant, heard something rustling around in the woods. So he sent out a reconnaissance and investigated what was going on. And sure enough, it was rebel cavalry getting ready to make a surprise attack on the men who were working. So quick, he ordered men to arms. Men grabbed their arms. He knew it was a rebel cavalry charge coming, so he said, "Fix bayonets." So the men pulled out the bayonet, put it on the gun, fixed the bayonets, come back to shoulder arms. When he saw the cavalry starting to come through the woods, he says, "Charge bayonets." And that's an order that all the men know, and at once they, "Huzzah!" and they get ready for the rebel cavalry. And so when the rebel cavalry comes out and they see 300 bayonets pointed at them, they're not so hot about charging into that. And we repulsed them with no trouble whatsoever. Now I'll say we didn't lose any man in that battle, but it was it made the men so proud that if I could get my bayonet yeah, we don't want them to come off too easy.
How much time do they have to put those together?
The bayonet? Oh, I mean, it's like boom, right now. The hardest part to this, while I got the gun, I might as well show you, is the loading process. It's a very difficult, but it's not like the guns that we have today where you slap a magazine in and you shoot it 5, 6, 7 times and you're ready to go again. This was one shot at a time. And the process was not the fastest process. The best Civil War guy could get a shot off probably 3 to 5 a minute with maximum. Average was about 2 to 3 per minute. And the reason why is that you had to reach down in here and to find one of these pouches. The pouch had gunpowder and a mini ball inside of it already. So you bite the end of it off, you pour the powder in, get the mini ball started, throw the powder away, throw the bag away, pull out the ramrod, and you had to really shove it because the balls were real tight. So it wasn't like it went down. So you stand there packing it, and you finally get it down there. Take this out because there's been many a times where these got shot and stuck in the trees and people think that they forgot to take them out. So you make sure you put that back in. You think you're ready to go? Nope. You got to half cock the gun, reach into this little pouch, grab out one of these little bitty tiny sulfur caps, put it on the end of the gun, fully cocked. Now you're ready to. So you can kind of see that it's pretty difficult under pressure, especially. Yeah, this is while cavalry is charging down at you, people are hollering, cannons are going off and things like that. So you can kind of see that, you have to be well trained and you have to be drilled constantly. So when the battle starts, that you don't have to use this anymore. It's just muscle memory. You don't have to think about it. You just go. And we have competitions where to see how fast guys can do that. But there's not cannons going off, there's not this and that going on, so it's a totally different thing. And then plus we really don't have to pack the mini ball in. It's mostly just, gunpowder fire. But that gave the men a lot of elan. They felt like, okay, the rebels tried to sneak attack us. We got on the line, we beat them back, we didn't lose a man, and that really gave them that oomph that they were going to need for their next fight. That next fight was one of the most sanguine of them all, and that was the Battle of Honey Hill, South Carolina. Honey Hill, South Carolina was at a railroad junction for the Savannah and Charleston Railroad. At this time, General Sherman was doing his march to the sea. And in cohorts with that, General Grant wanted to do what he called a concentration in time. There's different concentrations. There's concentrations in force, where the rebels did because they had interior lines. So if there was any place that was threatened, the Confederates could easily move their men back and forth and have a concentration in force in any certain point. Where we're on the outside lines, so if we try to get a group of men to a specific point, they have to take a longer route to get there. And what General Forrest always said, whoever gets there firstest with the mostest in Civil War battles usually won the battle. But to counteract a concentration in force, you use a concentration in time. Concentration in time is that every point that the Confederates are trying to defend, you hit them at once. Hit them at the same time. That way, Group A can't reinforce Group B or vice versa, and every man has to stand for his own. And this gave the Union a more of a coercive force, and it gave them more power at the impact than they had before. Because any other time before, it was just like two large bulls just beating their heads back and forth, because the Southerners could get there in time. No matter what plan we came up with or what great plan we came up with, it still took us more time to get there than it did the Confederates. So at the Battle of Honey Hill, this was one of those concentrations in time to where we were attacking the Charleston Railroad. Other groups were attacking other parts of the Confederate lines. And then that way the Confederates couldn't send men away to help General Hood fighting General Sherman on his way to Atlanta. So at Honey Hill, we were part of General Foster's brigade, who General Foster himself was an iffy general. He was one of those guys that was real particular about details, and he wouldn't advance his men until like all his ducks were in a row. And so by doing that, he allowed the Confederates to get to the railroad cut ahead of us again and fortify it. So now instead of us being able to just jump right in there and taking control of the railroad junction, we had to go in and fight a well-prepared defensive army. At first, we were doing fine. It was a more of a seesaw battle going back and forth. And during the course of the battle, our artillery got stranded on the wrong side of the lines. And so we didn't even have a chance to spike the artillery. So anybody knows that you don't want your enemy to take over your artillery and turn it back and shoot it on yourself. They were using the same cannons, using the same, artillery. So all they had to do was really basically bring their cannoneers up, turn those cannons around and point it and shoot at the Union Army. And there was nothing worse than getting killed by your own cannon. So at this time, General said, Foster said, we got to get those guns. And Captain Lindsey took Company D out in front of all the lines in an exposed position and tried to rescue those guns. Right when he was given orders to haul the guns off, Captain Lindsey got hit in the chest with a mini ball and died instantly. That left no officers on the field at that time. And Sergeant Massey, who was a black sergeant, took control of the men and went back to the lines in good order. But the guns were still out there. So we had to try one more time, and Lieutenant Bennett, a really good officer, they said, one of the most dedicated speeches to his men, and the bottom line was, he said, men, we are not going to allow those guns to be taken by the Confederates. And so the 300, I love it that it was 300, just like Thermopylae and the Spartans, that the 300 intrepid soldiers from the 102nd went out in those lines. Men were getting shot and hit, and they hauled the cannons off the field by hand themselves, which was a feat that was a Herculean feat, to tell you the truth. And Lieutenant Bennett received the Medal of Honor for his heroism and rallying the men to pull those guns out. Now, the newspaper accounts of this were quite favorable for the 102nd. And articles are written about how these men, some of them were shot in the arm through and through and refused to leave the battlefield. They came back to help pull those guns off, even though they were wounded. And that just makes me so proud when I think about how these guys struggled, the struggle that they had. They didn't want them there at the beginning. And then when they got there, they performed so well and admirably. It's like you can't help but take your hat off to them. And speaking of that, there was white regiments that saw what the 102nd had done, and they gave them the biggest huzzah, threw their hats up in the air, and said, "Go get them, 102nd." And that just made the men so proud and so full of pride that they knew that they had accomplished their mission. And another one of these examples of heroism was at Singleton Plantation. And also the 1st Michigan was one of the first Union regiments to step foot in Charleston. And, how can you imagine these Charleston citizens, a hotbed of the rebellion, to see these black soldiers from Michigan stepping through the streets of Charleston. And the man, that really filled them up with pride too. And some of these stories I wish I could bring to life, bring what they said, they felt, they thought. It had to be something that was just amazing, and it stood these men through some of the most vigorous and worst tests that America could bring on them. In our last battle, the Battle of Singleton Plantation, was another one of these battles where the Confederates, under General Foster again, just General Foster would always get us in bad situations. But we were, again, going to attack Singleton's plantation. Major Clark, which was one of the majors in 102nd, saw that the Confederates were about to flank the 102nd. So he sent a Lieutenant Barrow off to try to find help. Barrow took off trying to find the headquarters and say, "Hey, we're about ready to get flanked. We need more men." But he ran into a detached cavalry regiment, Union cavalry. And he came up with his own scheme. He said, "If I hit the flankers in the flank, we can turn the Confederates." And he did just that. He came around leading the cavalry charge, hit the Confederates in the flank. Major Clark, seeing that he had hit the rebels in the flank, charged straight forward, and they caught the rebels almost in a sledge and hammer movement and totally won the day and routed the Confederate army. And these small examples of the 102nd's bravery and their skill just really needs to be told, and I'm so happy that I'm here today to give a little bit of their story to you. I have a little personal story that always cracks me up when they talk about how America is a melting pot. That we were searching our family history, and I was looking for Civil War soldiers, into my family, Civil War soldiers, looking, having the hardest time, but then finally I found one. I'm like, Sims Kelly. Wow. But he happened to fight for the 14th Mississippi Regiment. He was a Confederate soldier. He actually got captured at Fort Donelson and died prisoner of war camp at Camp Douglas in Chicago. And if you look on the internet, they'll have a monument there for the soldiers that died at one of the most notorious prison camps that ever existed, worse than Andersonville, from the accounts of the men who died after they got there. And Sims was one of those men that died, and they erected a monument to those men. And sure enough, the first K on the list is Sims Kelly. And so it's kind of neat to see. It's like, how can you hate, the South, or how can you hate the Confederacy? And I only would be hating myself. And so it's a kind of a good way, and it's a good example of how, we are all brothers. We are all the same. This is a melting pot. They wanted to make it a salad, but a salad to me is just too individual. And if we keep on being individuals and not coming together as a collective, then we're going to keep the same problems over and over and over, and they're going to keep showing their ugly heads like they've been shown lately.
Preach. Amen.
So, in conclusion, I want to say again, thank you. And I know I kind of stumble over words from time to time, but I really love this story, and I think it's a very important story. And if you have any questions at all about Civil War in general or black soldiers, please feel free to ask. Okay?